Again, my apologies. It's not Chuck's fault. He was ready to go this morning. It actually is this morning there, isn't it, Jordan?
Yes, it is.
Chuck's back in Oregon, and it's started blueberry season. But he's taken the time to come and talk to us today about a really interesting character, the first modern influencer, the spin doctor, Edward Bernays. Just by show of hands, anybody hear of Edward Bernays before this talk today? Just put your little hand or unmute yourself and say yes, I've heard of him, or have no idea who this is.
Nope, never heard of him.
Studied him in college.
Oh, what class was that, Tom?
We had public relations and marketing.
Cool. Okay, that would be an appropriate place to hear about him. All right. Anyway, we're going to learn more about him today, and hopefully you will enjoy it as much as I did. Chuck, are you? Let's see, where are we at here? All right. Can you all see the screen?
I can, yep.
You can see
Yes.
it? Okay, sorry. I'm going ahead of myself here. Hold on. Just testing my controls. Okay. You are, I think, good to go. Chuck. Okay.
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks to everyone for tuning in today across the nation, from New Jersey to California and points in between. Not too many points in between, but here we are with the discussion about Mr. Edward Bernays. The L is apparently another part of his self-promotion. It was not on his birth certificate. He decided it would be better to throw in a middle initial. It supposedly stands for Lewis, but we'll just call him Eddie for our purposes today. Lovely ad you found there, Michelle. That really does sum up a lot of what he was involved with, and we'll discuss some of his methodologies and some of his philosophies, as well as his personal life. And hopefully we will cover everything that we hope to today. So we begin, and as you can see, the subtitle, The Art of Manipulation. We begin with his background. This is his great-grandfather, who was in Hamburg, Germany back in the 1800s, a local rabbi, and also was a forerunner of the Freud family, as we will see shortly. So this is his most prominent ancestor outside of Sigmund Freud, and we see the image from the old textbooks right there. We move on to the next image, and this is his uncle, and it's actually his double uncle, which is kind of interesting. His mother was Sigmund Freud's sister, and his father's sister was Sigmund Freud's wife. So double connection to this man. Called him Uncle Siggy. And they had a very interesting and relatively close relationship, despite the fact that Sigmund Freud did not get along with Edward Bernays' father, Eli. There were many family feuds. There's plenty of theories as to why. But Sigmund, again, in the post-World War I era in Vienna, Austria, was ultimately reliant upon his nephew in the United States to promote his works in the United States, as far as translating his works. And they did make a pretty good business team. Ed took over the chores of editing and put Sigmund's name a little more prominently into the American spotlight. It probably would have happened without Ed Bernays, but they had a pretty symbiotic relationship, fairly cordial, and there's plenty of correspondence to prove this. But Edward was born in Austria and came over as a child, a very young child, before his first birthday. His sisters were left behind with Sigmund temporarily while his father Eli got settled in New York City. And young Ed was raised in New York City. His father found a job as a grain broker, which was a mercurial job, had its ups and downs. So they were fairly well off for a period. And then when tough times hit, young Ed had to transfer from private school to public school. He graduated high school in the Bronx at DeWitt Clinton High School. And it was his first introduction to the full variety of Americana, which he was mostly shielded from during the wealthier days of his younger youth. By the time he was in high school, he was targeted for college, and his father was extremely adamant about him going to Cornell to become a farmer. Eli, Ed's dad, thought farming was the ultimate American experience, was the most solid profession, and Edward should follow in the footsteps of the classic American farmer. Unfortunately, Edward had no interest in farming. He had no interest in rural life. He found Cornell, a quote from Ed on Cornell, quote, little stimulation and even less learning. So he was going through the motions, one might say, at college, but he did manage to get his degree, and he got his first postgraduate job at a small publication called the National Nurseryman magazine. He found this job about as boring as college was, and so he moved on to another profession, also in the journalism field. But around this time, you see him as a young man in his 20s. He took on a job with a friend who ran two publications, the Medical Review of Reviews, and also a magazine called the Hygienic Gazette. These were not areas of big interest for Edward either. He did not know much about the medical world, yet he did know how to seize an issue and create publicity about it. And one of his first attempts at this was to promote a play that was entitled Damaged Goods. It was a play about venereal disease, which was very controversial. And it was a very frank discussion in the play about the realities of this problem. And it got quite a bit of attention. It was controversial. And again, Edward right away saw the connection between controversy and attention, and would certainly carry this through later in his career. Again, restless as always, he took a job as a press agent for a theatrical booking agency in New York City. And I believe if we go to the next photo, we will also see a very important influence in his life. This is his wife, Doris Fleischman. He knew Doris starting in their teenage years. They met out at the beach in Long Island. He was 17, I believe, and she was 16. And they had a 13-year relationship before getting married in 1922. And it was mostly a friendship during that time, but they were very close, very matched mentally. They were very much on the same page. And what's interesting about Doris Fleischman is before the marriage, this was during the 19-teens, she was a bit of a radical feminist. She took a job with the New York Tribune as a journalist. She became the first journalist, the first female journalist to cover a boxing match. She was in charge of the ladies' page. And then again, later on, she was in charge of the Sunday version of the New York Tribune. So she had a very prominent role in the public sphere. She was also, as I mentioned, an avowed feminist. So when they got married, this was very much an intentional act by Edward. She was asked to register at the Waldorf Astoria under her maiden name. And it was already prearranged that this event would be covered by the press. Edward had already worked for the Waldorf Astoria as a publicist. So he had it set up where as soon as it was discovered that a married woman registered under her maiden name, it would be reported to the press. So even his own marriage became a press stunt, and it got them plenty of positive attention. Doris Fleischman also became the first married woman to have a passport issued in her maiden name. Now, later in her life, after a long career as not just Edward's assistant, but literally his co-owner of the agency that he founded, she became one of the most important cogs in his machine, yet got very little credit publicly from Edward or anyone else. People who worked for them had really no idea how involved she was in the company. One of her most important roles came very early on. In fact, even before their marriage, she was already working for the company. And in 1920, she was charged with directing the NAACP convention, the national convention, and of all places, Atlanta, Georgia. She really was oblivious to a lot of the dangers involved in doing so, but she impressed everyone with her soft-spoken, hard-hitting ways. Again, she was a take charge person, but didn't need to be in the spotlight. And later in her life, actually relented with her maiden name and took on the name Bernays, Doris Fleischman Bernays. And her reasoning was that the birth name of Fleischman she had no choice in, but the married name of Bernays was her choice. So she embraced well into her, I would say, her 30s, the married name of Edward Bernays. But again, many people who worked for them didn't know she was as active as she was in the company. And she was also pretty much the organizer of a lot of his scattered thoughts. He was kind of the idea guy. She was the collator and organizer, and was very careful to stay behind the scenes, thinking that if these mostly men in corporations he was working for knew that this was a woman's idea, they might reject it. So that was part of her reasoning for staying behind the scenes and not creating too much of a flush. So again, we need to note Doris, and I think she would have been someone, had she not married Bernays, we would have heard a lot more about than we have. But she is considered, just as Edward is, a true forerunner of the modern public relations industry. So we move ahead to one of his first jobs as a theatrical booking agent. And again, this is before the marriage. This is in the mid-teens. He was connected with the Russian ballet. He was charged with promoting the ballet to not just New York City residents, but residents around the Northeast. And he used his techniques of media plants, meaning he would season and groom reporters to accept his press releases about things, simply explaining what the Russian ballet was all about, what these dancers were doing, about the costumes, about the music. He was literally training the public to learn to accept something new and exotic from overseas. And he used this particular photograph. This is a dancer in the company. Her name was Flora Ravalis. And this is a photograph taken outside of the Bronx Zoo with a harmless snake. But the drama of this photograph was meant to be highlighted and focused on. And what he said about this was the following. Quote, "I urged Ravalis to make a pet snake her trademark and never to travel without one. Without the snake, Ravalis, an attractive, provocative, and talented girl, might well have had to wait years for national recognition. The snake took up a long lag time," end quote. And this begins his career of attaching symbols and easily identified mascots to people in order to sell their wares, to sell their talents. And in this case, it was very successful. The Russian ballet, which we'll see in the next photograph, was at first tentatively received, and then was widely acclaimed for being something different and exotic and a new kind of entertainment, much more free and much more open. The dance styles and the costumes were very much considered exotic, and it was the pre-work of Bernays that helped, I guess, soften or prepare the public for such an exotic entertainment style. We'll go on to see his next assignment. He was assigned the job of promoting the little country of Lithuania. Now, at the time, again, we're talking about the late teens, early 20s. Lithuania had just broken away from the Soviet Union, and they were looking for recognition from the United States, from the world scene, and he was hired to promote all things Lithuania. And he used the same techniques that he used with the Russian ballet and that he would continue to use for the rest of his life. This would be in the form of press releases. Lithuanian songs were highlighted, and artists, photographs from the country were promoted. And again, it was simply an example of a promotion to gain acceptance. And I found it odd that a country would hire a PR company at this time, but it started a trend, and he would go on in the future to work either directly or indirectly for the countries of India, Guatemala, which we will hear more about later, Israel, and South Vietnam in the early 1960s. And his techniques really remain the same. One thing he was really good at, or at least his company was really good at, were coming up with catchphrases. And one of the catchphrases he used with Lithuania continued on in these later campaigns. Catchphrases like Lithuania was a bulwark against Bolsheviks. He used the same wording almost to the T when he was describing South Vietnam and its important position to block communism in the early 60s. He later recanted that and became a Vietnam critic by the late 60s, seeing where the public opinion was going regarding Vietnam. But again, this was just a brief job that he had. And his next large position in PR was to work for the next slide will show the famous Italian singer Enrico Caruso. Now, he became more involved with Caruso than he did in many of his other projects and employments, in the sense that he was about the same age as Enrico. They were both in their 20s, and they were actually traveling together through the East Coast when Enrico first came over. And what was very important, just like in the Russian ballet campaign, was for Bernays to salt the newspapers, as it were, with highlights and exciting press releases about previous concerts. He also truly enjoyed Caruso's company and agreed with many that he truly was a talented singer. So he was at the front row, basically, watching America and the people of America fall in love with this guy. He came up with the line, Caruso was the man with the orchid-lined voice. And he embraced the role, meaning Bernays, embraced the role of hero maker. He was helping to enhance the reputation of Caruso. He was increasing ticket sales by these press releases. And he also had very funny moments with him, because this is the only time he literally traveled on the road with a entertainment act. At one point, I believe it was in Cleveland, Caruso, during dinner, and there were people around, it was a highly visible dinner, he slid under the table to hide because he was afraid of the breezes coming in the room. So Bernays had to step in and explain what was happening, and all of a sudden people were very sympathetic to Caruso and his fear of cold breezes. He was inundated with pillows. Caruso traveled with a lot of his own bedding. And instead of it becoming a kind of a joke, it became kind of an endearing thing where, people understood Caruso was simply trying to maintain his voice, which was his livelihood. So again, even kind of questionable moments turned into positives for the Caruso campaign. And they parted on very good terms. And of course, we still know his name today, at least in part thanks to the Bernays effort. So we're coming up to the First World War at this point, and we have a Bernays trying to enter the war. We meet, first of all, his competitor, Ivy Ledbetter-Lee. Prior to the war, Mr. Lee, who probably has a more valid claim as being the first really effective public relations director, In 1914, Lee worked for the Rockefeller family, trying to improve the image of them after the Ludlow massacre took place in the mining camps of Colorado. And again, this was 1914. So Lee had a head start on the Bernays tactics and techniques, but mostly stayed in corporate America. He did not work for countries. He did not work for entertainers. He basically stayed in his corporate world, which gave him much less visibility. He didn't write multiple books like Bernays did, so he just wasn't the attention seeker that Bernays was, but deserves credit at least for being a equal forefather of the PR industry. But again, we come up to World War I, and we have Bernays trying to enter into the military. He's refused because of his flat feet and his poor eyesight. So he ends up joining a group called the Council on Public Information, or the CPI, because of his overseas connections. He had already been acknowledged as a skilled promoter. So he's basically hired as the head of the export section of the CPI. He's also the co-head of the Latin American section of the Foreign Press Bureau. And these groups are basically entrusted with convincing the world and the other countries that America's in the right place at the right time. It's all promotional, and it involves sending postcards and letter writing campaigns to, again, promote the cause of America. And we see here, the picture shows Woodrow Wilson at the Versailles Peace Treaty Conference. And one thing that really upset Bernays for the rest of his life was he was assigned to disseminate information at this peace conference. He was part of a small group, and he was in charge of releasing a message to the press, which read, quote, "Our work of the CPI at this conference is to keep up a worldwide propaganda to disseminate American accomplishments and ideals," end quote. And by including the word propaganda in this press release, he angered his superiors. It's not known if Wilson was aware of the person responsible for the word, but it already had a bad connotation. So not only was the press release denounced, but it was also disbanded. The entire press group of 8 or 10 individuals was released from their duties, which may have influenced in the long run the negative reaction to the peace treaty in our country, where it was not voted in favor of when Wilson returned. So we see his frustration working for the government. But right after this period of time is when Mr. Bernays went into private business. And again, he recruited his wife, or his future wife, away from her job at the New York Tribune. So she became not only the co-owner, but the kind of the person behind the scenes, and they started taking on more work in the PR world. And we move on to our next slide, and this is actually going to show you his. Actually, these were the types of press releases he was involved in for the Committee on Public Information. That's a very interesting bulletin I have not seen. So that's exactly what he was doing. He was trying to, well, I guess, spin the war and the post-war efforts into a pro-American viewpoint. So going forward, we see the next major campaign he was involved with, and this is actually 1924. So between the end of the First World War and 1924, much of his time was spent writing books. He wrote 2 during this period, which are to this day considered amongst the most influential in the public relations world. One is called Public Relations, and the other one is called Crystallizing Public Opinion. It was written in, I believe, 1922, the first one, and the second one he was working on during this time, and it was released a little bit later into the 20s. But this is his first entry into politics. He was called in by the Coolidge handlers sometime in the summer of 1924, and this is a period where Coolidge had taken over the presidency from the late Warren Harding. but was now having to run a campaign for himself. And he was considered so bland and so boring and so difficult to sell that they hired Bernays to try to spice things up a little bit, because there was concern about his reelection in the middle of 24. And so the idea Bernays and his wife came up with was to bring in celebrities from New York City. And you see Al Jolson on the right of the president right there. And it was a very specific campaign. It was to involve, I think, about a dozen celebrities, and they were picked up after their performances on a given night, prearranged off Broadway. They were loaded into a special train. They took the overnight train to DC, where they were met by cars and brought to the White House, where they were fed a large breakfast, which was all covered by the press, of course, because one of the key techniques for Bernays was always making sure photographers were there. He knew them, he paid them off, whatever it took to get coverage. And so the result was a very favorable view of Coolidge in the press. One of the headlines said, "Coolidge almost smiles," where you can see he actually did smile right there. So that was not even an exaggeration, that was the truth. Whether he was posing or actually enjoying himself is unknown. But at any rate, Coolidge won in a landslide, and it was considered a victory for the new idea of a public relations group backing a political candidate. The success 100 years ago was in the victory of Coolidge in the fall. And I'm pretty sure he would have won without Bernays' help, but it certainly didn't hurt the public image of Mr. Coolidge. We will see a failed attempt in the next election coming up shortly, but for now, we can see that the influence was positive with the press, and it just emboldened Bernays to continue his campaigns. And this is his next big campaign. He's hired by this man, George Washington Hill, who's the son of the founder of the American Tobacco Company. He inherited a very successful business, and his goal was to make it even more successful. One of his goals right away upon inheriting the business was to increase sales to women. He thought that the taboo on women smoking in public should be broken. And his quote to Bernays on this campaign was, quote, "It will be like opening a new gold mine right in our front yard," end quote. And indeed, Hill was very serious about this campaign, paying Bernays a $25,000 annual retainer to be on board and to help figure out ways to get women to smoke more. Interestingly, Mr. Hill also had Ivy Lee on retainer, unbeknownst to Bernays. So they were both working for the same company on retainer, working on different campaigns, but did not know the other was working for the same guy. So that was interesting. At this time, the focus was on thinness. This was an attempt to equate tobacco smoking with loss of weight. Tobacco was seen to be either an appetite suppressant or even a dessert replacement. And Bernays' attempts were successful in getting restaurants to include cigarettes on their menus and things like that. Also, the key was not so much to bust down taboos about women smoking. It was really about them smoking in public. That was the key. I think women were smoking some, privately, but to bring it out into the open and to make it okay was really the goal of this campaign. And this went on for several years, with Bernays utilizing famous people such as Arthur Murray, the famous dance school instructor, who came out with the statement about how my dancers all smoke because it helps their health and their well-being and such. And all of these stories did increase tobacco sales to the point where Mr. Hill was at this time enjoying a $2 million a year plus salary and a very successful company. They increased business by 1928. They added $28 million to their coffers largely as a result of the targeting women to smoke campaign. And we will see it gets even a little more intense in 1929 with the next slide. Actually, I'm not sure about the year. I believe it's 29, but it could be 27. It's the Torches for Freedom campaign. And this was a very calculated effort led by Bernays to have, I believe it was a dozen debutantes and society women from New York City, all in their 20s and early 30s, all very slim, all very stylish and well dressed. And the coordinated campaign was to take place on Easter Sunday during the Easter parade. These women would be strategically placed in different locations and then all meet with their cigarettes hidden under their coat or their dress. And then they would all pull out the cigarettes and light them in public with the photographers all around. And this became known as the Torches for Freedom campaign. Before this happened, Bernays was very diligent about contacting psychiatrists and leading mental health experts in the country. And the title came from one of these experts. He said that I believe it was a man named A. Brill who came up with the slogan, and he said we have to equate the feminist movement with the cigarettes. We have to give them the power that men have had in public to feel comfortable smoking. And sure enough, it's likely this campaign that contributed to the early death of Michelle and Amy and my grandmother, who died in her early 50s, probably started smoking right around this time. She was 13, 14 years old at this time. So there could be a direct connection there, although she smoked Winston's, not Lucky Strikes. But the Lucky Strikes effort was another George Hill promotional. He had put a lot of money into the coloring of the Lucky Strike packaging. So you see the green with the red. And what happened is women were apparently not fond of Lucky Strikes because the color clashed with most of their outerwear, most of their fashionable clothing. So the idea that Bernays came up with might be his most bizarre idea of all, because this wasn't a country, or it wasn't really a product he was trying to sell. It was a color he was trying to sell. Hill said, we're not changing the packaging. We spent too much money on this green and red packaging idea, so we're leaving it. So Bernays said, well, let's change everyone's idea about green. Let's turn green into the fashion color of the year, and we'll have events, and we'll have companies backing us up with new organizations to highlight the color green. So we see some evidence here of the green focus. You see the woman in the green bathing suit on the left. And again, this is all crafted around the idea that not only can they be healthful, not only can cigarettes be leading to lower weight, but also they can be fashionable. You can flash the box of cigarettes and not have it clash with your clothing. So this was called the Green Campaign, and it was considered not a wild success. Sales did not skyrocket by any means for Lucky Strike, but the part that was considered successful might have actually been the fact that it was possible to promote a color, that it was actually possible to change fashion styles based on relentless media focus. And again, Bernays understood the media deeply and hired basically the Waldorf Astoria to have a green ball in 1934, and it became the talk of the town. New fashions were created just for this particular event. He came up with an idea called the Color Bureau, which was the Color Fashion Bureau, which was an attempt to legitimize green, not just for clothing at this point, but they were going beyond that with interior decorating, curtains, etc. This was a wide campaign, and even paint companies were involved in this to sell the color green as a status symbol, as a fashion trend. And again, it was considered not successful so much in the lucky strike part of it, but it was considered successful in that someone could actually successfully promote a color. Just another thing before we leave the tobacco world. This did breed controversy. There was a senator from Utah by the name of Reed Smoot, who was a Mormon, and he was also involved in the sugar beet industry. And he saw these cigarette promotionals, which were basically trashing sugar, convincing women to not have dessert, to smoke instead. He called the ad campaign an orgy of bunkum, quackery, and downright falsehood and fraud. Again, more of a promoting his own interest rather than a moral stance against cigarettes. But what Edward Bernays would say later, again, I'll try to throw in as many quotes of his as I can because he had a lot to say about his profession. One of his quotes was, "Controversy breeds coverage." So he was never afraid of controversy. He always knew it could be spun into something positive. And to some degree, any attention was to be considered good attention. And the next quote I'll throw at you was this one, quote, "Age-old customs, I learned, could be broken down by a dramatic appeal disseminated by the network of media," end quote. So this is, again, his astute understanding of how society worked, how people were influenced. And again, he's using his uncle's theories on childhood, on suppression, to get deeper into the American psyche on how they operated and how they bought things and how they decided things. One of his techniques also, which he started to really cultivate and fine tune at this time, was his use of basically fake front groups. He was really good at creating names for these front groups, like the one he created to promote tobacco. It's the Tobacco Society for Voice Culture. And again, this ties in with the ad you saw at the very beginning, where the doctor was smoking cigarettes, proclaiming their health benefits. So again, he was brilliant at this technique. And here's another example of one of the things he was asked to promote. He was approached by the national pork industry, not one particular company as much as the industry in general. And again, what's also notable is that most ad campaigns to this time would basically only promote one brand. In other words, if Beechnut called, to promote gum, most advertisers would only promote Beechnut. But Edward had a bigger plan, and it's eventually what he came to call Big Think with capital letters. And it was a much longer view, but his techniques remain very similar. And in this case, when he was hired by the Pork Board, he contacted physicians, nutritionists, et cetera, to get opinions on what constituted a hearty breakfast. And the surveys showed that at the time, America, probably not all that different than our fast-paced world of today, was really into a quick breakfast, coffee, a donut, or a piece of bread, toast, and maybe juice, and go. It was breakfast on the road. But there was this counter effort by Bernays to say, with nutritionist backing, that we need to eat a hearty breakfast. We actually need to put the calories in after that long fast of no food overnight to get the energy we need for our day. And thus began the bacon movement in this country, which has certainly not slowed. In fact, it's picked up a lot of steam in the last few years, as far as I can tell. And again, the eggs just came along with it. He did not work for the egg industry, but they just got the benefits of his bacon campaign. So this is just one example of the many, many ways that Edward Bernays influenced our lives and the lives of our forerunners in ways that we don't think about. Another example I'll give you right now is around the same time in the 30s, he was hired by a book publisher. And again, the simple way to look at it from a typical advertiser of the era would be, well, we're going to promote our books, like Simon and Schuster. I work for them, so our books need to be sold more. Well, that's not how Edward thought. The big think of Edward put the idea into his employer's head that we need to convince home builders, we need to convince cabinet makers, we need to convince architects to put bookshelves in houses so that books will automatically fill them. Not any one company's books, just plain books. Again, subtle and brilliant in its kind of underhandedness. It's really not a direct sell. And he was really into this, and he called it appeals of indirection, which sometimes confuse his employers. The employers had to really trust him, because other than that, a lot of his campaigns sounded silly and kind of stupid, if you didn't really stay with him and his focus. And again, this was another successful campaign. And if you look at houses built during this time, you will see built-in bookshelves. And that did not last. It was a short era, but I never realized that was a part of an ad campaign that book companies were behind. But again, he used every method possible. Like I mentioned, front groups, mass letter writing campaigns, alliances from different groups. He knew that, and this is one of his quotes, he knew that when information came out from what seemed like different sources and it matched up, it made it more credible. And his quote on that is, "Emphasis by repetition gains acceptance for an idea, particularly if the repetition comes from different sources." Again, one person repeating something over and over again isn't as effective as multiple sources repeating it, even if behind the scenes, those multiple sources are really just one source, as they often were in the case of Mr. Bernays. So we move forward to one of his failures, and this is Mr. Herbert Hoover, who successfully ran for president in 1928 and then failed to gain re-election against Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. So sometime in 32, they approached Bernays to come back and try to recreate some of the magic that he put into the Coolidge campaign in 24. Again, conservative business owners were scared of the FDR imagery and the rhetoric, so they thought the likes of Bernays could help Hoover win. And we know the results, very disappointing results for both Bernays and Hoover, but Bernays was too busy to really care much. He didn't get directly involved in politics, so to speak, at least presidential politics after that. But he was involved behind the scenes on other campaigns. For example, in 1940, he came up with the first psychological voter profile during the New York City mayoral election, when he was hired by William O'Dwyer to try to defeat Fiorello LaGuardia. And again, it was an unsuccessful effort, although O'Dwyer eventually gained the mayoral position later. But notable is that this was the first attempt to get into the voters' heads, to see what needed to be said by a candidate to what audience. He was very specific. He said, when you're speaking to the Italian Americans, you have to emphasize this and de-emphasize that. When you're speaking to Irish American audiences, you have to say this and not that. So it was really the first systematic attempt to predict voting trends and to influence thoughts on prospective voters. And of course, now this is fairly ubiquitous, and we see it in all sorts of different forms, from polling to think tanks and such. So right now, and we're kind of in the middle of his career. We're going to go on to another thing that he promoted. The next slide would be beer. He was hired by the National Brewers Association, and this is right after Prohibition ended, to regain America's interest in beer drinking. And the way he did this was interesting. Again, not working for a company, working for the whole industry. He tried to position beer as the alcohol of moderation. The beverage of moderation was his slogan. And he directly was trying to challenge the spirit makers, the distilled folks, who he felt the public could be convinced that they were producing a dangerous substance. The strength of the distilled spirits was something you really couldn't safely enjoy. But beer was the working man's drink. It was affordable. He mentioned that many times over, the affordability. And again, trying to reconnect a drinking public with something that had, obviously been illegal for 12 years and wasn't nearly promoted, or it wasn't as common as distilled spirits were during Prohibition, because distilled spirits were far more profitable, far more easy to move because they didn't take up as much space. And I'm not saying that beer wasn't made during Prohibition, but it wasn't a commercially, black market success because it was just too bulky, and it wasn't strong enough to do the job, so to speak. So he had to reverse public opinion, and by all indications, he was very successful. But it's not the only company he worked for. We're going to just give you a short list of different companies he worked for and different organizations, and it's a wide range. We already talked about Lithuania and the Russian ballet, but he also worked for a company that made hairnets. And the reason he was hired is because hairnets were starting to fade away as the women's hairstyles were getting shorter. And so he didn't try to change fashion, but what he tried to do was to get new rules passed through lobbying politicians to get mandates that hairnets needed to be worn in food industry and in healthcare industries. So the hairnets got a new market thanks to Edward Bernays, and it was considered a successful campaign. He also worked for luggage makers, and we're not quite yet to Walter, but we're coming up to him. He worked for luggage makers as wardrobes were reduced. He wanted to make sure that people would adjust their tastes in luggage to make sure the luggage companies would keep going. He promoted Dixie cups. And one of his front groups, which I just love the title here, was the Committee for the Study and Promotion of the Sanitary Dispensing of Food and Drink. And again, it was all about the sanitation. No lips have touched this cup, the Dixie cup. These were his campaign thoughts. And again, Dixie cups to this day are a well-known American icon. He also worked for New Jersey Bell, trying to promote phone service. He worked for Knox Gelatin. He worked for the American Library Association for very, very low or nominal fees. Again, he was not averse to working for nonprofits. ASPCA was also one of his clients, but so was Cartier's jewelry. He worked for them for quite some time. He sold ivory soap for Procter & Gamble, one of his longest standing clients. He had a 30+ year relationship with Procter & Gamble, and he put ivory soap on the map by promoting soap carving campaigns for kids. And this was a multi-decade campaign that got a lot of ivory soap in the public consciousness. I'm not sure if it really increased sales all that much, but it certainly continued as an iconic soap. Beyond his relationship with Procter & Gamble. He worked for the Columbia Rope Company. He worked for Time Magazine. He worked for the Waldorf Astoria, and often earned more than the CEOs of these companies, which rankled some. But at the same time, when they saw the profits go up, they usually relented and were thankful for his presence in their company lives. We move on to the next slide, and this is Walter Lippmann, contemporary of Edward Bernays. And I can't find any evidence that the two ever met, but certainly Bernays was influenced by Lippmann, and Lippmann was influenced by Bernays. Lippmann is kind of a forgotten figure in journalism, but I do want to mention a couple things he was involved in. He was the father of the term the Cold War, and he also gave us the term stereotype. That was not a known term until he started using it, but his interest was wide. He was a columnist, he was a journalist, he was an author, and he was very much in sync with Bernays on this particular topic. They both believed that the world was really run by a very small fraction of elitists, and it needed to be because the masses could not be trusted to do the right thing. Lippmann's book in 1922 called Public Opinion was considered a kind of a breakthrough book on this topic. And Mr. Bernays came out the next year with a book crystallizing public opinion. So again, they were working kind of hand in hand, but not intentionally. It's just that they were influencing each other with their ideas of how a modern democracy was really a false ideal and needed to be managed and controlled by these pro-technocratic elitists. And I believe Lippmann thought Bernays was doing a very good job in his PR work at controlling the masses. And as a result, unfortunately, robbing consumers of their free will, which is another quote that comes out of this era. But again, an influential journalist, kind of an all-around critic. It's hard to find too many things he was in favor of, but a powerhouse, and again, one of the influences for sure on Bernays and his work. We move on to the next slide. This is the 1939 World's Fair poster created by Joseph Binder. It was a very futuristic World's Fair, and Mr. Bernays was hired to help promote it. His role in the World's Fair was to work on a futuristic model city, which he called the Democracy, and it's part of the World's Fair exhibits. But the other connection Bernays has here is he helped turn this particular World's Fair into a very future-looking consumer display of corporate America. This was the first World's Fair you could say that corporate America took over and really used it as a launching pad for new products and future products. And again, tied right into what Bernays was doing. And I believe he was proud of his work for the World's Fair, and it was considered ahead of its time with its, obviously the futuristic poster there is an example of what their focus was on. And again, this is not highly focused upon in Bernays's life. His autobiography doesn't talk much about it, nor does his biography. But again, this was part of this period leading up to the Second World War, where you can see his influence was going beyond the commercial world. This was not really direct commerce. This was indirect, kind of a promotional fair to plant the seeds of commercialism in the future consumers of America. And we see the buildup to World War II also included some accusations that by now, with Bernays well into his career and known worldwide, that some of his ideas were falling into the wrong hands, including the hands of the next man. We go to the next slide, and you will see someone who found Bernays's work quite useful in his propaganda campaigns. And if Michelle can get to the next slide, that would be helpful. It should be right around the corner. And next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. It's Goebbels. Yeah, Goebbels had some of Bernays's works in his library and directly copied techniques from the Bernays page on controlling the masses and such. So it was a rumor at first that Goebbels was using these techniques and using his handbook. When it was confirmed, and I'm not sure exactly what part of the war this was confirmed, Bernays was not apologetic. He said, "I have no control how people use my work, but the only answer to people using propaganda for evil means is to counteract it with more propaganda of the better kind, of the good kind." And that was his mantra on this subject to the end of his life. He would not take responsibility for putting these ideas into Goebbels' head. But again, he said, you simply have to take it as it comes and counter punch the propaganda that's being thrown at you. One of the quotes from this period from Bernays is, "In an era of mass communication, modesty is a private virtue and a public fault. end quote. And he says that multiple times later in his life in different forms. And another quote on his evolving profession of public relations, he called it an art applied to a science, which is a fairly apt way to put it. He was indeed, in many ways, an artist. His creativity on these campaigns equals that of an artist, but he was able, and this is likely largely with the help of his wife, he was able to fine tune it down to a more formulaic, systematic, scientific approach, which produced more reliable results, I would say. And our next quote gets us into one of his next jobs. Briefly, though, during the war, I'll just say this: the Second World War, Bernays' role was limited. His business suffered. There wasn't a whole lot of business going on. He became kind of a promoter of American ideals. He wrote a couple of books about democracy and patriotism. So again, it wasn't a prolific period for him. But shortly thereafter, he's hired by the United Fruit Company to help increase banana sales. And this is the 1940s. So by this time, bananas had been part of our country's food supply for about 50 years. The banana republic's origin began probably in the 1880s, 1890s. And then companies such as the Boston Fruit Company, which becomes the United Fruit Company, starts buying up land in Central American countries, to the point where in Guatemala, they had purchased over 200,000 acres and were exporting millions of dollars worth of bananas annually. But to the owner of the company, it wasn't enough. There had to be a way to promote bananas further. And again, Bernays goes to his tried and true techniques of contacting healthcare professionals. He locates a doctor who had published a paper slightly earlier about how bananas were a natural cure for celiac disease, which I think we know more about now than we did 30 or 40 years ago. It's kind of come back around. And again, this was considered in other medical circles an anti-diarrheal, and again, the research was showing now very high levels of potassium in bananas. So all of these things were highlighted by Bernays, and sure enough, sales increased significantly during this period. But what was also happening during this period was the rise of a socialist government in Guatemala. The prior leadership periods in Guatemala, going back to the 1880s, had been very favorable to foreign intervention and foreign control of the natural supplies. So this was kind of a shakeup for the United Fruit Company folks when somebody became president who started taking land back from the United Fruit Company and raising taxes on outside businesses and such, which was a threat to the United Fruit Company. That person was followed by his military director, who would be the person in charge of the military. His name was Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who took this to another level. He took the control of the native lands even further away from United Fruit and was giving away what the United Fruit thought was their profitable banana country. You can go to the next slide now, and we'll see Mr. Arbenz Guzman, who was certainly not a capitalist. He could be labeled a socialist. He was trying to uplift his people, and he was part of a democratically and legally elected government, but again was considered a complete threat to the future of the United Fruit Company's profits. So the United Fruit Company decides to step up the campaign against Guzman, and using Mr. Bernays' talents and techniques, they create a real bad guy out of Guzman. They claim he's under Soviet control, which was not true. They claim he had communists infiltrated his entire government, which was not true. It was simply that he was a leader who was for the Guatemalan people and not for the foreign capitalists, which seems reasonable from a Guatemalan standpoint, but was not reasonable to the employees and to the people associated with United Fruit. So, with the change of our government in 1953, this is the exiting of the Truman administration and the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, things look very favorable to push the Arbenz government out and to return to leadership a much more friendly capitalist based government, or at least capitalist favored government. And sure enough, Bernays' role in this was significant. He was very, very skilled at planting negative articles about the Guatemalan government. He took reporters on junkets to the area, all paid for by U.S. Fruit, but no one really acknowledging that it was paid for by U.S. Fruit. They were brought down there supposedly to just see what was happening in person, and they were going to go back home and just write their honest opinions about what they were seeing in Guatemala. But it was a staged event. They were only taken to sites that were pro United Fruit Company. They weren't allowed to talk to actual citizens. So unless they were favorable to United Fruit. So again, it was a very slanted, allegedly open kind of media investigation, and almost unanimously, the reporting was anti-Arbenz and pro any government that would come in and be friendly again to the United Fruit Company. So we got involved at this point militarily because, luckily for the United Fruit Company, the Eisenhower administration included men like John Foster Dulles, who was a former counselor for the United Fruit Company, obviously in favor of them continuing their business as the leader of the Banana Republic movement. And sure enough, with the help of this man, CIA operative E. Howard Hunt, who shows up in so many nefarious stories, he's well worth a look on his own. Although it's hard to gather the actual truth from his biography because the contradictions are large in trying to research his story. But we do know he was involved as one of the key CIA operatives in the military takeover of the Arbenz government, and it took place in June of 1954, I believe, and it lasted about 2 weeks. It was not a long, protracted war. It was simply a takeover by so-called freedom fighters to take back the government, to give it back to the United Fruit Company. And Hunt shows up in so many other stories. He shows up at the Bay of Pigs. He's involved in the Kennedy assassination. He's involved in Watergate. So pretty much you name a story of controversy for a good 30-year chunk, and this man's squarely involved. So I had to throw him in the mix. But again, this is a strange story in the sense that this is a PR campaign to overthrow a foreign government that was very successful. And again, it goes against, of course, the platitudes about democracy and elected governments and the sanctity of all that. And of course, the real story didn't come out for quite some time after the deeds had been done. So history often it's late in catching up to what really happened, but that's partly why we're here today. And we move along to some of this is the family. This is a daughter, Anne Bernays, who is still alive at age 93. She is an author of fiction, and she is also an educator. And it has been fairly critical, not completely, but fairly critical of her dad's work, of his techniques and his trickery. But again, she's part of the legacy. She wrote a fictional book about, I think it's called Growing Up Rich, that was largely based on her own accounts, growing up rich. So again, offers an interesting perspective if you ever have a chance to listen to some of her talks or a documentary we will approach here shortly. She is involved in the documentary Century of the Self. I highly recommend listening to her. She's very eloquent and has a lot to say about her dad. So we move along to the next slide, and this would be Old Cambridge. Yes, this is the town that Bernays and Doris decided to move to after semi-retiring in 1962 or so. They moved from New York City up to Cambridge, Massachusetts. They, of course, like the intellectual stimulation, and right away, Mr. Bernays, who's now in his 70s at this point, he's involved in a campaign to save sycamore trees. So again, he can be involved in overthrowing governments, or he can be involved in saving trees. It really almost didn't matter to him sometimes what he was advocating, because he was just so good at it, and he liked to show off his skill. And sure enough, the sycamores were saved thanks to his coordinated efforts, starting letter writing campaigns and front groups and all of that. It's the same technique, whether it's countries or trees or hot dogs or bacon or whatever. He's always using these same finely honed techniques. And his retirement becomes kind of a separate part of his life. Again, because he lived to be 103, this is a very long retirement period. But he was very a vital part of the Cambridge community, often hosting parties, frequently giving speeches and lectures, and receiving young students from around the world who wanted to talk to the legend of public relations. And he was more than happy to talk about his life and himself, and spent his last, I believe, 30 years up in the Harvard area. So we go to our next slide, and we see the documentary, I believe. This was put out in, next slide. I think it's coming up. Next slide would be Century of the Self. Yes, this is it. This is a 4-part documentary available on YouTube. I've watched the first 2 parts. They're an hour apiece. And I found it very helpful and very useful in presenting the Bernays story. And also, I'm looking forward to finishing it, because it doesn't stick with Bernays completely. It goes into Freud's daughter and her influence during the 1940s and 50s in this country. But I do recommend this. It's a very well done, very thorough documentary, talking to many people who are no longer with us about firsthand encounters with Mr. Bernays and what he stood for. So this would be a recommended view. And now we go to Edward as an elder. I just want to talk a little bit about his retirement years. This is him probably around age 100 at this point. And again, he never really stopped. In some ways, he never stopped working. But as one person said at this point, his name was Bill Reuter, someone who was involved in public relations out of New York City. I like this quote. He says, "My overall impression of Bernays is that he had only one client, and that was Edward L. Bernays. And certainly for the last 30 years of his life, he was the father of his own propaganda, and really, really became a strong advocate for his own role in the birth of public relations. And because he outlived most of his contemporaries, there was really no one to refute him. He would angrily counter anyone who challenged that title. He was also a party animal. This was throughout his life, but increasingly as he got older, and especially after his wife died in 1980, he became, he had a need to be surrounded by young people. And so he would often have really large parties with famous people, and he was known for knowing everyone's name and knowing every position they held. He was in demand as a guest speaker. And also, he was an advocate during his retirement years for government licensing for public relations professionals. And this was not supported in the public relations field. He was ostracized by many for this belief that people should be passing tests before they become PR professionals, which I found quite interesting. He also found the time to write a approximately 900-page autobiography in 1965 that was too cumbersome to read, but I did refer to it a bit. And again, it's mostly a chronological account of his work life. He mentions his family very little. From one of his daughters, this was not Anna, this was his other daughter, Doris, I believe was her name. She has a story of when she was a kid and she asked her dad, "What are we?" And she was referring to their religion or ethnicity. She was being told she was Jewish, but they weren't practicing Jews. So she asked her dad, "What are we?" And he said, "You're nothing." And she says, "What do you mean? I don't understand." And he said, "Well, when you get older, you can decide, but right now you're nothing." And so that was his response. And also his response to his daughters regarding his title was, "Just call me Eddie." So growing up, they called their dad Eddie as at his request. And when one of them called him dad or father once, he said, "Well, do you want me to start calling you daughter? Just call me Eddie." He was insistent on that. It was a very informal parent-child relationship, it seems. There was no discipline whatsoever. They were pretty much run by nannies and mom, who was often home when she wasn't helping at the office. But he was a distant dad, not unusual for the era. Many dads were more married to their work than their families, and he couldn't stop working. I mean, his parties were, a lot of work for him. I mean, they were work professionals. They were discussing PR. It wasn't like they were talking about, baseball or golf or anything. He had no pastimes in his entire life. This was a man who rarely set foot outdoors, was opposed to fresh air and sunshine, thought sunshine was poisonous, which it can be. But again, he was so into his life work that he overlooked many other parts of his life, which again, not an uncommon story for the era. But again, to finish, I would like to review his thoughts on public relations, which of course dominate so many aspects of our life today. And some of his techniques are so common today that they don't even get credited to him because they've become part of the fabric of our country. In fact, the author of this book, which was key for my research, this is the 1998 book by Larry Ty called The Father of Spin. His introductory paragraphs mention that this is not just the story of Edward Bernays, but it's the story of our country, because he's so integral and interwoven in the way we do business today, whether it's religion or politics or consumer goods. It doesn't really matter what topic you choose, you're going to come back to some Bernays influence, no matter what angle you take. And again, his views were not that complicated. I can give you an example of his simplest campaign that he was ever involved with, and it still is with us to this day. He was hired by the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation to increase awareness and to increase funds for this foundation for research. And the first thing he said, and the only thing he said, was change multiple sclerosis to MS. And they did, and it worked. And that's an example of the simplicity that he could employ to achieve a goal of simply raising awareness. And certainly that included raising funds, which again was very effective. But his overall thoughts were this on public relations. He thought he would enter a job and it would be a two-way street, meaning that the client's needs would be reviewed and the public needs would be reviewed. And he would go into a period where he would try to evaluate, why do both act the way they do? And of course, with the client, it was often very simply to try to make more money. Now, it wasn't always the case. Like I said, he did work for many nonprofits. But more importantly, he really was trying to focus on why the public acts the way they do. And he used quite a few of his uncle's techniques and methodologies to get to the point of what the public or why the public was doing what they were doing and what they really wanted. And his goal mainly was to how do I affect the public to get them to act differently, whether it was influencing an innocent public who had no idea what the Russian ballet was. It was simply introducing them to it to allow them to accept it. Whether it was the breakfast story where he focuses on one side of a nutritional argument to help increase the profile and sales of bacon. Again, he was always trying to get people to act differently without them even really understanding or knowing it. And also, to his credit, he tried to appeal to the better nature of humanity. For example, tying in ad campaigns or public entertainment type campaigns with fundraising for charitable causes. He connected these early on in his life. When I go back to one of the stories I started with his first promotion of a play that was called Damaged Goods, which was the one about syphilis, he also, as part of that awareness campaign, he solicited funds for healthcare, funds for foster care. All of the people who were affected most by syphilis were helped by the fundraising that he tied into his campaign. And again, he stuck with this throughout his life. Now, there are obviously examples where he didn't do that. He wasn't doing fundraisers for the people of Guatemala who had their land taken back from them from a legally elected president, and the land that got reverted to United Fruit. He did nothing for those people, but he did have an element in him where he knew by appealing to people's charitable heart, it would increase the visibility and increase the credibility of the campaigns he was working on. In his eyes, his results of his career turned out this way. He had mostly happy clients, which was generally true, not continue. I mean, Herbert Hoover wasn't all that happy, but he did have mostly happy clients and happy people, meaning a happy public. The consumers were happy eating bacon, wearing green, trashing Guatemala, whatever. He thought he was increasing to the happiness of the United States public. At the same time, he was achieving a massive amount of personal wealth and power, which of course he enjoyed and liked and flaunted, despite the fact that he wouldn't buy new shoes, wore the same old ratty suit all the time. He also owned 4 or 5 houses and had, 8 servants working for his family or whatever. So, he was enjoying his wealth and power. And he also really, really believed that what he was doing helped to create a better nation. He was that full of himself that he thought his helping to control the masses, of which he excluded himself to the point where he was such a loner that he would not join any public relations organization. There were several that were founded in the 20s and 30s that he would buck against because he didn't like being beholden to a group think mentality. He wanted to be out of that circle, to be able to be a freelancer and to continue his approach to sales. He also looked at freedom as an admirable notion, but impractical in a nation this large and unequal. So he overlooked freedoms, and he realized that no, controls really have to be put in place, and freedom can't go unchecked. Because, as I mentioned earlier, he believed we are dominated by a trifling fraction, those are his words, of which he considered himself one. We are dominated by the trifling fraction on the planet, and amongst that group, he considered himself a wire puller. So his comparisons, and this is from his detractors, of which there were many, both in the profession and out, when he calls himself a wire puller, this gives credence to the thought by his enemies and the people who did not find him a positive person. They called him the Wizard of Oz. They called him basically as fraudulent as the Wizard of Oz because he was simply acting a certain way, but behind the scenes he was just a fragile guy, trying to upkeep what he had started. So again, this concludes the main portion of our program today, and I hope I covered enough to keep folks focused and interested. And again, I can't stress enough how influential this person has been in our country and in our lives. And there's a reason we don't know about him, because I don't think he really wanted the notoriety outside of his own profession. He definitely was happy to be below the radar, because I think he believed he can get more done. But in his profession and in his field, he did not hesitate to self-promote. And like I said, he was his number one client. Out of all the 435 clients he had, he was probably first on the list. And thankfully for historians like myself, he left 805 large boxes of material to the Library of Congress, which was not allowed to be looked at until after his death. So he knew a lot of his shenanigans would get exposed after his death, but he didn't care about that. He wanted the true story to be out there. And to his credit, he did not destroy anything. He kept the tiniest scraps of paper, which helped put pieces together for historians who really didn't know the full story of Guatemala. There's 8 boxes on Guatemala alone that confirm a lot of suspicions that he was heavily involved in the overthrow of the Guatemalan government. So we'll conclude there, and we'll be happy to take questions, and any comments are appreciated.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting. My other question was, did you ever get involved in the movie business with the smoking advertising in movies?
Yes, he did. I can't say to the point of like product placement like we see today. Like he wasn't necessarily involved with trying to get specific products in movies, but he definitely utilized celebrities to achieve his goals. And the rising stance of the Hollywood and the New York theater certainly played into his role as an advertiser. He like the 1924 campaign with Coolidge is a good example where he understood that, and even from his experience with Enrico Caruso, he understood the magnetism that celebrities were gaining through this period, and he certainly utilized that magnetism to achieve his goals. The Green campaign was another one where he didn't get strangers off the street to wear green. He wanted the wife of a celebrity or a society woman who everyone knew the name. He was using names to give more credibility to his campaigns for sure. So in that sense, I would say yes, he was very aware of celebrity status and knew that it was useful to achieve his goals.
Did you know that there's the color green is very popular right now? It's, I don't know, this brat movement and pushing the green color. I don't know if you know about that, but green.
Not much. So that was 90 years ago. He did the first green campaign. So maybe it takes 90 years for the cycle to come back. Yes,
Right.
I wonder. Well, thanks.
Welcome. I need
You
to
know,
read
as-
more about brat. Brat is the new.
I'm not familiar with, is that a movie, Brat?
No, it's some word that these young people use, you know, you brat or something about brat.
Okay.
I need to find out more about it.
a big media star referred to Kamala Harris as brat, and it's actually supposed to be a positive thing. So I'm curious, as well as Jennifer, in terms of what it means to be brat. But apparently, within the lexicon of younger people, being brat is a positive thing, and this is a positive development for Kamala Harris's campaign to be a brat. In the past, to be called brat would be bad, but now it's a good thing.
I wonder if she'll start wearing green more so.
That's possible.
Yeah. Let's keep an eye on that.
Yeah, Chuck, Jennifer asked about the movie, and we didn't use this quote in this presentation, but this is a quote from Edward Bernays. The American motion picture is the greatest unconscious carrier of propaganda in the world today. It's a great distributor for ideas and opinions. The motion picture can standardize the ideas and habits of a nation. Because pictures are made to meet market demands, they reflect, emphasize, and even exaggerate broad popular tendencies. rather than stimulate new ideas and opinions. The motion picture avails itself only of ideas and facts which are in vogue. As the newspaper seeks to purvey news, it seeks to purvey entertainment. So it's, that's sort of a sign of the times. It's a quote from the times, and we can talk, till the cows come home about how influencers today, the social media influencers of today are, kind of what the movie industry was back in the day, when we first had motion pictures. And, Dad always talks about before and some of you may remember this, before the movie, there were the newsreels. So you didn't just go to the movies for the movie, you went to find out what's going on in the world. Back in the 30s, that was a popular thing. But now every kid has a device, and, people are looking at these, everybody's a celebrity and everybody's promoting something and everybody's an influencer these days.
Very, very interesting. Going back briefly to Walter Lippmann, he had some very interesting quotes about truth and the news, and his overriding thoughts were that because humans are the ones reporting the news, they're always reporting through their own filter. They're always going to have their own biases influencing the story and the way they report a story. So he looked at all news as suspect. And until people can actually discern and look through the guise or the filter of our own, biases, you're just getting what's told you, and if you're just accepting that, you're often accepting a lot of fake news or slanted news or half truths or anything else. So reading Walter Lippmann was eye-opening, just to compare it to Bernays, because Lippmann wasn't selling anything. Lippmann was simply selling his own works. He wasn't selling products for anybody, but they're coinciding in that sense of their society is too unwieldy to just allow to go free. We have to have some sort of controls, and what you just quoted from Bernays, which I hadn't seen, which is a great quote, that this is how the trifling fraction uses the tools to placate, to control, whatever the words you want to use, to influence society. And it's very clear that is how it works to me. I mean, it's pretty obvious.
As time went by and it became clear exactly how dangerous cigarette smoking was and exactly how many people he had succeeded in killing with his marketing campaigns, did he ever comment on that? On how he had sold the whole notion of how smoking was chic and women would lose weight, usually because they were starting to suffer from lung cancer and such. I was curious if he ever had any feelings or any comments in terms of the role he had played in actually pumping that poison into people. And by the way, I read he never smoked himself, and he tried to get his wife to smoke because he believed that it would be bad for her health.
Yes, that is correct. So absolutely, it's true that Edward Bernays never backed down on anything. He never admitted anything, except possibly a few times he changed positions, like with Vietnam. He was trying to educate our American public about South Vietnam in the early 60s. But by the time the late 60s rolled around, he had jumped off any bandwagon that was pro-Vietnam, and he was actually strongly against the war by that point. But with smoking, he knew by the early 1930s, reports were already coming out about the dangers of smoking. I mean, they knew centuries before, doing autopsies, what the smoke was doing to people's insides. It wasn't new information, but he definitely redirected a lot of those official reports and suppressed them in order to keep his tobacco campaigns going. And that is a correct story, that his wife was a pack-a-day smoker, and he would not only tear up and flush her cigarettes when he found them, he told his kids to do the same thing. Just throw them away. Don't let her see you. We don't want her smoking. So he actively kept at it, and eventually she stopped on her own because of a doctor's warning, basically, that you were going to have a leg amputated if you kept smoking. But no, he never showed any remorse over that. He simply kind of backed off by saying, well, we didn't know what we know now. But he knew. Most people didn't know for sure, until the Surgeon General slapped the warning on the cigarettes in the early 60s. But he knew, because he was so involved in information gathering, he simply put aside the ones that didn't fit with his plan. So that's part of his, I don't know what you call it, amoral streak, or like, I'm not going to say an evil streak, but there was something in him that was above the morals, because he had a different goal and it was working for a client. It wasn't trying to improve the health of a country, but he could use that with bacon, which, how healthful is bacon anyway, but he would use things to his advantage as needed, and then dump things that weren't to his advantage and hide them and repress them. Things were found in his notes, again, the 105 boxes at the Library of Congress. It's all in there. There's all sorts of contradictions that show up if you bother to go through the details, because he was good at suppressing things. He was good at undercutting, just side swiping or going around things. He definitely was always on point with his goals, and usually successful.
To me, there's no moral gray zone there. If you know that you're, basically molding this campaign, which gets more people to smoke, and you know that it's something that is harmful, that is killing people. I mean, whatever kind of job we are involved in our lives, if we actually know that we're involved in something that is actually harming others, severely harming innocent people, then it's something that you have, if you have any sense of conscience and any sense of decency, you would not be involved in it. You would remove yourself from that, not to push it and push it and push it to the breaking point.
Well, perhaps, again, I'm just speculating here, but perhaps the way he compensated for that inner knowledge was, I'll give you an example, early 1930s, and I'm not really sure who he was working for at the time, but he was hired to promote basically socialized medicine in this country. And he was talking about things that are still controversial, universal health care, basically. And it was a sincere campaign. It was not, he was, again, being paid to do this, but it was a sincere campaign that used every technique he used on all the other campaigns. And he ended up getting completely blocked. This is one of his failures in his life. He was blocked and knocked over by the American Medical Association, who used his own techniques against him to rail against the idea of socialized medicine. He quit the campaign, gave up, and never went back down that road. He never fought against the AMA again, which is an example of, maybe that's the guilt compensation factor, where he felt somehow inside bad about promoting something bad, and he was trying to counteract it by promoting something good, and got slammed and never went back down that road. I found it interesting that there was this concerted effort and I know we've talked about it in some of our political discussions, FDR days, about, nationalized healthcare, and that was a one and done for him.
It's still, the way they market things is still incredible. My DVR just went down the last week or so, and prior to that, I rarely ever watch commercial television. I don't know if you do, or if you just go right through. If you do, you just mow right through the commercials. Now that I'm waiting for my new DVR in the mail, I'm actually, when I sit there for my Law and Order marathon, I'm actually sitting there watching these commercials for pharmaceuticals. And it's absolutely insane. People dancing in fields, wonderful. Just as you were talking before, there was one on here for rashes, but its side effects include heart attack, stroke, cancer, blood clots, destroying your immune system. But everyone is still running amok, dancing in the fields and laughing and giggling and such. They have the ability to somehow, with these campaigns that were to a large degree really fine-tuned initially by Bernays, to be able to countermand people's native intelligence, their understanding of facts, and to be able to, I guess, if people turn out that they're susceptible and gullible, does it make it okay for powers that be, for individuals with control of the message, to be able to lead them down a path of self-destruction? And they are going down a path, in many cases, of self-destruction. Keep the rash. Instead of, some of the side effects, Chuck, you'd be better off being at the Somme in World War I and being mustard gassed. You'd be better off with that than you would with the medications they're offering and such.
That's right. Yeah, I'll stick with the rash, thanks. The side effects of the rash are itching. I can handle that. Okay, we'll find something mellow to put on it. Yeah. So again, it's amazing though how the Bernays view of the world, and again, a lot of his early impetus to do what he did was based on trying to prove his father wrong. I mean, it goes back to again the Freudian childhood stuff because his father was a hard ass. His father was, pushing him to be a farmer. His father criticized a lot of his early jobs, like the job working as a press agent for the Russian ballet. His father loved going to a show, but he didn't want his son working with these actors and actresses and these vagrants and these foreigners. Like he couldn't stand that. So I think he was always in that mode of trying to prove his father wrong. And even long after the father died, he was still in that mode, never really backed off. And again, like he was so all in on his methodology, it just coincided so well with capitalism. I mean, selling stuff and promoting stuff. I mean, it went hand in hand. I mean, and again, he's not the inventor of advertising by any means. There were ad campaigns going back to the 1890s. I know Nabisco had one of the first national ad campaigns in newspapers. The National Biscuit Company, that's one of the first ones they were trying to sell nationally. But the techniques he fine-tuned, again, like you say, are very much with us today, and almost exaggerated versions of that, with your pharmaceutical examples, which I'm certainly aware of. And again, it comes back to a personal story regarding pharmaceuticals and the fact that in the 1950s, when New Jersey giant at the time, Hoffman LaRoche, was trying to push a new product called Valium, they brought in an ad executive who is the founding father of the Sackler family, well known for their Purdue marketing of OxyContin. So the original Sackler who was involved in pharmaceuticals was the guy who convinced pharmacists and convinced not so much direct to the people at that point. You had to go through regular channels back then, but he convinced them that you need Valium. And again, this was a drug that was not created for a need. The need was created after the drug was created. There really was no need for Valium, certainly not on a wide scale usage, but it became normalized thanks to the Sackler family efforts at selling the drug to the public. And of course, again, at that time, selling it to the pharmacists and the doctors who would prescribe it. Now we do it the opposite way, where you go in and tell the doctor, I saw a commercial with happy people dancing in flowers and I want that drug. And the doctor's like, I never saw that commercial. I don't even know what you're talking about. And they have to play catch up to find out if the drug's appropriate or however that works. But again, I did see a parallel with Sackler and Bernays, and I would bet that Sackler was an acolyte or at least a follower of the techniques of Bernays, because it seems to be the same story. Let's create a need where there is none. That's what Bernays' earliest mantra was people up until a certain point in time, say the 19 teens or 20s, bought for need. They bought what they needed. At some point it changed to now you're going to buy what you desire. It's the change from the need to the desire, which isn't all bad. We should have what we like and what we want, but to the point of not knowing we wanted it till we saw a commercial, that's taking it to a new level of desire.
So Chuck, this is an old ad. It's not, it's why it's not a Roche ad, but it's a similar drug. You can't set her free, but you can help her feel a little less anxious. You know this woman. She's tense. She's angry. She's irritable. Sounds like me. She's felt this way for months. Beset by the seemingly insurmountable problems of raising a young family, and she's got her mops and her iron and everything else, and you can't set her free. She's a slave to all the stuff she has to do, but you can give her some, whatever that is, Oxypant, whatever that's like Valium, whatever type thing. And then that's it. That's the same that same style of advertising.
Yes. We know what you need. We know.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe I do. Maybe I do need that. Yeah.
And then everything is ask your doctor, blah, blah. And believe me, your doctor will be more than happy. I remember when I got a tooth pulled and he was trying to give me OxyContin. And I said, oh, I'm fine, I'm fine. And he was like, this was like about 15 years ago. We were having an argument, literally a shouting argument. I'm like, I don't need a painkiller for this. He said, no, 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 no. Just take the prescription. You need this painkiller. It's incredible. I remember when I was a kid, they used to teach us about drug pushers, and the vision was like of a guy in a black trench coat standing in front of your school trying to give you pushing drugs on you. But now it's not the guy in the black trench coat, it's the guy in the white lab coat who's sitting in your examination room with you. Your doctor is sitting there and will gladly pump you full. We have the most over medicated people in the world right now. Only the United States and New Zealand have this where you can advertise pharmaceuticals on television to the people. In every other industrialized nation, you can advertise to health professionals, but you cannot advertise to the people. You can't sit there marketing this, trying to get people stuck on these drugs. And the people in this country are sicker than ever. We're over medicated and sicker than ever. That's a show you could do on the American healthcare system.
I totally agree. And just one aspect, going back to the OxyContin story you mentioned from 15 years ago, that was the peak of the OxyContin push. And when I say push, I mean that it was pushed not just by the Sackler company, not just by the company making it, but by the FDA. They were fully on board. They probably shortchanged some of the testing to get it out on the market early because they were all about pain relief and they were all about, ending the suffering of people who really needed it. Unfortunately, when the table turned and OxyContin became seen for what it is, which is an extremely insidious drug that literally changes your brain chemicals to the point where you can't just get it back by stopping OxyContin. It rearranges synapses and brain function to the point where it takes years in some cases to get your normal brain functioning back. And I've seen victims of this, and some of those victims are no longer with us. And my problem has been with all of the focus against Sackler and against Purdue Pharmaceuticals, where's the focus against the FDA? The FDA dropped the ball hugely and now is taking zero responsibility for all of these cases. And, we've had the billion-dollar settlement, then it's been overturned, and now they're arguing over whether to take the billion or to retain the right to sue and blah, blah, blah. All of these discussions, the FDA is scot-free, clean, and not part of it, and that drives me up a wall because they're the block between the companies and the people. They're supposed to be the filter, checking to see if stuff's legitimate and useful, and I'm not saying OxyContin didn't have any uses, but by the FDA getting behind it so much and helping to push it, they're equally, if not more responsible, and somehow get off scot-free. Drives me crazy. Nobody talks about this. Nobody.
And then the Sacklers, they were really beautiful. I mean, they then wanted to create treatment centers to get the people off the drugs they had hooked people on. So they wanted to get you coming and going. They wanted to get you hooked on this stuff. And then it's like, well, we'll catch them on the back end of this as well by creating all the treatment centers for all the people that we helped make into addicts. And the FDA, there's a lot of money there, and money will grease the wheels of that situation.
Here's another ad. Here's another ad, Chuck. Reduce psychic tension. Do you see it on the screen?
I see it. That's a scary
looking ad. Scary she looks. I don't want to be that.
Wow. That's Sackler. That's a Sackler ad for sure.
Sackler.
That's great. That's me in the morning. Looking out of bed.
Chuck, why don't you tell us about what we're doing next time?
Okay, next month in August, I'm not sure the date. Michelle can clue you in on the date. I know I have it written down. We're going to investigate a bit of a more lighthearted topic. We're going to look into the origin story behind the phenomenon known as Perry Mason. I've only recently become fascinated with the 1950s, early 60s television series. I remember it growing up, falling asleep, like listening to the boring dialogue in black and white and everything with grandma watching. But all of a sudden, I've kind of come to appreciate it, and it certainly isn't going away. There's been a new movie series put out on the Perry Mason story. But getting into the origins has been fascinating because the author of Perry Mason, an author named Earl Stanley Gardner, was a lawyer in Los Angeles in the 19-teens and 20s, and he based the character of Perry Mason on a very real person who we will get to meet and hopefully get to enjoy the next time we meet. So it's going to be a Perry Mason origin story, and it's going to be a little bit light and fluffy, but that's okay after covering some heavier topics. And then we get back into the history zone for September. I believe we have lined up a return to the presidents, and we're going to start with John Quincy Adams. I decided to pick up a biography, and I became increasingly fascinated. So that's September. But yeah, August will be fun. I think she said the 18th. I saw that 3 o'clock. Is it really 3 o'clock or is it 2:30?
Monday the 19th at 3.
Okay, 3 o'clock. Okay, just double checking. Monday the 19th.
I'll have to triple check that one.
Okay.
How is that show? How is that? I've never watched Perry Mason. I've watched the new one on HBO, but I never watched the old one, not a single episode. Is it worthwhile or?
Well, it lasted for 9 seasons, so there's like 300 episodes or something like that. I can tell you a few things that are notable about the show. Number one, the executive producer was a woman, Gail Patrick Jackson. That was very unusual for the era. So there is a bit of a flair that's different, I think, because of that. Also, their acting ensemble, meaning the revolving cast of extras, was a very, very solid cast. I mean, they attracted the best actors and actresses, probably because they were well paid and it was a popular show. But again, looking at the supporting cast, there's plenty of people who went on to famous careers and people who are ending their careers. So it was a really great ensemble core cast, but again, the supporting cast that often used the same actors and actresses in different roles over the years was very notable. But again, Perry Mason is it's a formula. It's when I understood the formula, I kind of got it more, and it's often following a storyline of a wrongly accused murder victim who Perry helps to get off using a series of clever detective techniques and models. And sometimes he kind of pushes the law. He'll break and enter. He'll occasionally do nefarious things to get to his ultimate goal of having his client found not guilty or having the charges dropped. So again, some people get bored with the formula. For me, I haven't seen all 300 episodes, and sometimes I just check it out to kind of fall into a zone of that era. I love the cinematography is often very, very interesting. They use a lot of Los Angeles traffic, Los Angeles boat docks, street scenes, the vehicles. All of that has just kind of a cool cachet with me, and I think it's really a very upstanding and very, very well done program. So that's my initial interest, and going into the origins is even more exciting and interesting for me because there's real connections to the fictitious Perry Mason played by Raymond Burr. I'm looking forward to it.
We're looking forward to it too, Chuck. Thanks everybody, and thanks again for this another enlightening, informative, and I don't know. I think I'm gonna buy more green after this.
just don't smoke in the meantime. Wear the green, but don't smoke.
I will. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Have a good one, folks.